Welcome to Sunspots, where we explore the many ways that the Holy Spirit is working in the people, places, ministries, and missions on the surface of the sun. That is, the Synod of the Sun. I'm Valerie Young, your Synod leader. My prayer is that you find inspiration, community, and connection in the Sun. Today, I got to sit down with Reverend Tim Blodgett, the General Presbyter for Eastern Oklahoma Presbytery. We talked about his role as GP. Side note, he's not a bishop. His learnings about when to enter into situations in churches and how some really good things have come from the pandemic. We also talked about the Native American churches in Eastern Oklahoma and the Presbytery's efforts to rebuild not just the buildings, but also relationships. Tim has a really interesting background, and I was surprised to realize how much we have in common. I hope you'll stick around and listen. But thanks for being with me today, Tim. Is it executive or general presbyter?
General Presbyter.
General Presbyter for Eastern Oklahoma Presbytery. Thanks. Tell us your story in a thumbnail.
So the way that I always start is that I didn't grow up in the church. I've been doing church work since 2007 when I graduated from seminary, but I didn't grow up in the church, and this wasn't a place that I really expected to end up. My mom was Catholic, my dad was Baptist. When they went to go get married in a Catholic church in Michigan, they'd gone through all the premarital counseling, they had done all of the things. They get to the wedding rehearsal and the priest decides that he can't do the wedding and that he's going to have one of the deacons do the wedding instead because my dad is Baptist and he had obviously been Baptist and known all of this the whole time. And so that upset my family. And we just didn't go to church growing up, that if you're going to be that kind of judgmental or whatever, that was just not going to be what we were going to be about. I was baptized in a Catholic church, but growing up, I just didn't go to church. Every once in a while I would go with friends as I spent the night or something like that. So It's very unexpected that I ended up in this work and ended up in the church in general. But that was something that kind of started as I was going into high school and then into college, of needing something different and needing some spiritual depth that I obviously didn't have, kind of being away from the church. Started to get interested and then felt a very deep and strong call into church and then into leadership in the church. And so I think my freshman year in college started attending church, and then by Easter the next year I was a member of First Presbyterian Church, was an elder and working as a youth director and doing all this kind of stuff. And then not too long after ended up in seminary in Austin. So it's been an interesting journey from the outside of the church in, and then always kind of keeping those eyes. I mean, I love the church and I love the tradition of the church, and I'm a traditionalist in a lot of ways, but I've always kind of kept that outsider vision of the church as well. So after I graduated from seminary in 2007, I the first church I was called to was a small church in Oklahoma City called Greystone Presbyterian Church. Was a small dying congregation. They really wanted to have one more shot at making it, and they ended up selling their manse to afford having a pastor for the first time in about a decade. They interviewed a lot of people before they called me into that position. And they had a lot of discussion about kind of which way they wanted to go and whether or not a younger pastor, especially one straight out of seminary, would be able to kind of come into that situation. So I was not the first choice, but I ended up being the choice. And then that sent us on a pretty interesting journey of seeing what the church was and trying to learn how to lead a church, all at the same time of doing redevelopment work and transformation work. And then that ended up leading us down a road towards actually leaving that location and then starting a new church development on a growing suburb of Oklahoma City. So that's kind of how the ministry journey got started, serving a lot of committees and things at the presbytery level, getting that new church development off the ground, and then leaving that about 5 years ago to come and pastor a church here in Tulsa. Tulsa is home. So this was a return back home for my wife and I. And it was at Southminster for about 3 years before coming into this role.
Wow. There is so much about that that I think you and I have a lot in common in terms of, I guess, bits and pieces of your story, right? Because I didn't grow up in the church. And I really have to ask you, you said that first call, you weren't the first choice.
Yep.
But you were the person that they went with. And yet it's safe to assume that you felt that was a call, that was
100%.
Yeah. What did that, I just want to explore a little bit. What did that feel like to know that you weren't the first choice?
I mean, I've actually never been the first choice for any of the positions that I've taken. I don't think. I mean, there's been other people that have either turned the position down or they've taken another call before it's been offered to me. So that's always been an interest. And then any other time that I've interviewed for positions that I didn't get, most of the time I was the second choice. So it's always kind of been part of the call process of, and I think it's about discernment. If you're not the first choice, or if another candidate takes another call, I mean, that's just as much a part of, the call process of where my call intersects with their call, intersects with the work of the church. And so they had looked at an older minister. They'd looked at one that was younger, but then had some more experience than I was coming out of seminary. And because it was a redevelopment church, in a lot of ways, no one wanted to take it. It was perfect for me because I needed to get back to Oklahoma City because the woman that was going to be my fiance shortly thereafter was here in Oklahoma. It was here in Oklahoma. And so I needed to, my hope was that my call and my location would match. And so Oklahoma City ended up working out for us for that. But I sensed a call to be there, especially after I started working with the congregation, getting to know them a little bit better, and just kind of the places where my gifts of ministry matched up with what they were needing at that time. I had just, my internship had been at a 2,700 member mega church in Oklahoma, in Austin. And so taking kind of big church principles and bringing them into a smaller church context, and then also coming in with a lot of, energy of youth was helpful. But that was a congregation that had a lot of really good people that had been in the church for a lot of years. There was a retired church educator, Marilyn Lofbaum, who was there and had loads of information about the church and churches that she had worked in before, and an organist that had been there for 40 years, 20, 40 years, something like that, and had just had a lot of experience in church setting. And that was what I needed coming into serve church for the first time.
I love the way that you put that as a part of the discernment, right? For, and sort of the interlocking piece for not only for you, but for the other candidates for that position. That's, for me, it's always interesting to think about, because I know that I wasn't the first choice, not only for the role that I have now, but I know I wasn't the first choice back in 2014 when Judy Fletcher was interviewing administrative assistants. And so, but that set a trajectory for me, just very much like what that call did for you. So that's really cool. So tell us about your family. Is that the one who was going to be your fiance? Yeah.
So that story goes that my first paycheck that I got from serving that church, I went and put a down payment at least on an engagement ring, and then we got engaged. So like I started there September 1st of 2007, I guess, and we got engaged like 2 weeks after that when I got my first paycheck. And so we got married the following year on a beach in Jamaica because I've been around enough weddings, and she had had a cousin that had a $50,000 wedding right before then. And so we didn't want to do anything kind of big like that. So we did a resort wedding and got married on the beach, and it was wonderful. And so, and then it was just us and our dog, Sydney, for a lot of years. And then almost 8 years ago, we had our first son, Evan. And then he was followed by Simon, will be 5 in October. So it's the 4 of us and Sydney, who's still around, but a little old and crotchety at this point.
Awesome. So not having grown up in the church, and I want to say you're so young. For me, it would be a late start in ministry, but obviously not for you because you're so young. But what made you want to be a presbytery leader? Why would you, after feeling called to the ministry, what made that feel like your next step?
Yeah, so when I was in Oklahoma City, in Indian Nations Presbytery, I served in a variety of roles. And I've always had a kind of broader care about the church than just, there's some pastors who are very good at just caring about their church, and that's where they feel called, and that's wonderful. My vision has always been kind of the interconnectedness of our ministries, the interconnectedness of the denomination and the presbyteries, and how we're able to help one another. I deeply believe that we are a connected church. And the way that connection plays out is at the presbytery level, and in our system, it's on committees. And so I served on the committee on ministry almost immediately upon arrival in Indian Nations Presbytery, and was put in a couple of situations that were pretty kind of above my pay grade and experience almost immediately. A very deeply divided church where I was the moderator and some things. And so that kind of gave me a broader perspective about what was going on in the church and the denomination. A lot of conversations about, are we going to close this church, or what should we do for new church development? I was on a new church development task force even before we even had a sense of selling that church property there and starting the new church. And so having that broader place, but then also I was a part of a lectionary group with some really great pastors, and hearing what they were going through, hearing what other friends in the Presbyterian across the denomination were going through as they were entering churches, as they were dealing with a lot of the dysfunction that often happens in churches, and then thinking, what are the ways where we as a presbytery can help those folks out, or walk alongside them and learn together. There's a lot of resourcing, a lot of experiences that we can share with one another if we get connected and do that. And so that had always been my vision of what the presbytery should be. And that wasn't necessarily what was happening in Indian Nations at the time. And so ended up as the moderator of the mission strategy group, which was the council for Indian Nations at that time, and started thinking more broadly about how can we support congregations and leaders, and started making sure that we were advertising all the mission grants and scholarships and things that were out there, getting people connected with conferences that they might not have heard about that would have benefited them. And just that kind of gave me a broader vision of what the ministry could be. So that was kind of where all the seeds for being in mid-council work really were planted, is seeing that. Indian Nations was also going through some pretty difficult times at that point as well. Failed leadership and dysfunctional leadership and communication issues and lack of vision, and a variety of things. And you can go down the rabbit hole of that. But as I was involved with that and trying to help with that at the time, that also made me think, I wonder what it would be like to be in this leadership position in the future.
I think sometimes some of the best models are the models of what not to do.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
and I would say that across my ministry that, I have been in a number of situations where I've learned much more because of the negative examples of others,
Mm-hmm.
and even my own failures than I have from just anything that I've read or whatever. In my internship year, I was halfway through that, and the pastor ended up leaving the church, and so that was kind of the first. I'm going to learn a negative lesson from what was kind of happened in that situation, and then helped me to kind of grow from there as well.
Mm-hmm.
So in Indian Nations, that was a piece of that as well. So when I came to back to Tulsa and was serving at Southminster, I was involved in a number of committees at the presbytery level, and I really didn't have an idea that I wanted to come into this position. Gone to General Assembly just as a visitor when it was in St. Louis. Knew that the General Presbyter was retiring, and that there would be a search, but I had just been at Southminster for 2 years at that point, and didn't really think that the timing matched and would work
Mm-hmm.
out.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward to that year when they were doing the search, and they were trying to make it kind of line up. If he's going to leave on January 31st of 2019,
Right.
you go back a year and they were doing that search, through a variety of phases.
Mm-hmm.
And that was during a time of a lot of retirements across the denomination. And there was a lot of positions that were being filled. And as that search kind of kept on, I knew that they were because I know all the people that were on the committee, I knew they were very faithfully trying to find somebody for this role. But then at the same time, I was sitting there thinking, I really hope that they don't get the wrong person, having lived through that in another presbytery.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was what it kind of inspired me, that if this is God's timing, I will I'll put my name into the hat for this, and we'll see where it goes. And the more that we explored that, the more that the committee explored that, my experience, a lot of my experiences, positive and negatively, I think really helped call me into this role in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was an interesting search
Yes.
to be a part of. So tell me about how your sense of the connectional church and your love for the connectional church. How are you seeing that play out in Eastern Oklahoma Presbytery right now?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that the stories that I go back to and tell folks is that when Kobe Bryant was retiring from the NBA, there was this sports writer that said that his greatness was his belief in himself, and that was what drove him to achieve and accomplish all the things. And my belief is that we are better together, and that we are better as a church when we are connected with one another. And so my belief, despite all the reformed theology about total depravity and everything else, my belief really is in that the people in the pews and the pastors that we have in this denomination can do incredible things, especially if they're connected with one another and given the resources to accomplish those things together. And so I'll stake my career on that every single time. And so that's been my kind of guiding principle, especially during this pandemic time, of how can we get people connected. One of the kind of known issues in Eastern Oklahoma Presbytery coming in was how disconnected, coming into this role, was how disconnected this presbytery was, particularly the pastors in Tulsa, where you would think that since we're kind of all here in one area,
Right.
we would be more collegial with one another and more connected and everything. And that just wasn't the case. We had tried for a number of years and in a number of ways to connect regionally with one another. And there were some places where that was working and some places where it was working very well. But there were a lot of holes in that as well, of people who were people or churches that were kind of choosing to stay out of that, or for issues with theology or denominational things, just were not plugging into it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was one of the things was a priority for me coming in. My first 9 months or so, just kind of getting my feet underneath me and seeing some of that playing out, and trying to do that in the kind of regional setting that we were doing it. When the pandemic starts, now we can't meet regionally and we can't meet any other way. And so we began doing Tuesday afternoon roundtables on a weekly basis. And that was one of the kind of odd miracles of the pandemic, of here we are forced by this virus to not be in contact with one another. And yet some of the great connection that we needed in EOP happened, and only happened because of that.
Right.
So we were having, a dozen to 20 pastors and presbytery leaders gather on a weekly basis, doing a devotional, doing some check-in time about what are people facing in the church life and personal life, a lot of health and anxiety kinds of things shared in that forum. And then spending about half of that time around some sort of resourcing topic. Initially it was, how can you do worship online, and what kind of equipment do you need, and doing even the nuts and bolts pieces of that. And you think about all that would have went into doing that prior to the pandemic and us using Zoom as much as we do. And then we were able to do that, kind of shift and jump into doing that almost immediately. And so that's been, I think, one of the big successes. There's still holes in that as well. I mean, to have probably 16 regular participants in that still leaves out, a ton of people in the presbytery. And we're trying to figure out ways to get retired pastors involved in their own group, because Tuesday at 1 p.m. might not be the best time for them. But it forms a foundation for how we can do some of this connecting in other places. And then that's led to us being able to tackle some projects and things that we might not have been able to do otherwise.
I think that's true for all kinds of councils of the church, in terms of when the pandemic, initially started, there was better connection through phases of that than there has been in the church for a very long time. And I think the EP Forum is also a really good example of that. The fact that the executive, all 11 executive presbyters, or I should say 12 from each of the 11 presbyteries, continue to say, yes, we want to check in weekly when, if you can't make it, that's okay. But we want to continue to have that standing meeting, and that has developed community like it wouldn't have been possible before. And I know that that's true in Eastern Oklahoma as well. I hope you've been enjoying this episode of Sunspots, a region of the Presbyterian Church USA. We are Presbyterians in Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Texas, with dynamic and hopeful ministry happening in the name of Jesus Christ. If you have a good news story or an exceptional ministry to be highlighted, send that good news to Sunspot at synodsun.org. Now, back to the show. What are some other things coming out of Eastern Oklahoma Presbytery, whether it's as a result of the pandemic, or what are some of the exciting things coming out of Eastern Oklahoma right now?
Well, one of the things that came out, I think, as a direct result of the pandemic and of the Tuesday afternoon meetings was trying to think of some retreat ideas. The past year and a half, have just been so nerve rattling for everybody, and so draining, and just there's a lot of dysfunction in churches and a lot of just hard decisions that are having to be made. And so are there ways in which we can give pastors some respite from that? So one of the ideas that we had talked about and kind of thought about doing prior to the pandemic, but it was kind of way out into the future, was doing a backpacking retreat. And so earlier this year in June, we had 9 pastors go on a backpacking retreat in Southern Colorado. And that was community building, and it was a good retreat. It was a little more strenuous than I think some of us would have anticipated it being, but it ended up being a really good time of connection. And then that has also kind of driven us now into, can we think of maybe a little bit less strenuous option for the next retreat? So we're talking about doing a more kind of in one place retreat the week or two after Easter of 2022. And so, and then doing another backpacking retreat over the summer. So trying to get some more of those options out there. That also made us think about the ways that we've been doing presbytery meetings and just kind of splitting out some of the work that is being done there, so that, especially since we're doing it by Zoom, do we have to have worship and meeting and, retreat kinds of things and fellowship kinds of things, or can we do fellowship over here aside from the meeting so that it's not 12 hours long or whatever.
Right.
And so that's another one of the conversations that has come out of this. One of the, and this isn't a direct result of the pandemic so much as just the timing. So the General Assembly last year sent 2 reports to the Presbytery about kind of the state of Native American church buildings physically, and then Native American church ministry more generally. And that's really inspired EOP to re-engage with the 15 Native American congregations that we have in this presbytery.
I will just say, before you go, I just want to make sure that people understand that Eastern Oklahoma, of all the 11 presbyteries in the Synod, Eastern Oklahoma has, you said 15, that's the most Native American congregations in the Synod. That was a surprise to me.
Yeah.
But right. Sorry to interrupt.
And I think we're up to 98 or 99 Native American churches across the PCOSA. And we've had at least 2 different instances where we have rediscovered Native American congregations that had fallen off of the map or the count for one reason or another. We discovered we had one that we had always counted, but that wasn't being counted nationally. And so that's how we ended up getting to 15. So we have Park Hill Presbyterian Church is the one Cherokee Presbyterian congregation in the denomination. So we have these 15 Native American congregations here. Once upon a time, they were their own presbytery under the auspices of World Mission and with the denomination. And between that and then just them not being integrated necessarily into the everyday life of Eastern Oklahoma Presbytery, when they did become a part of this presbytery, there's been great ministry going on there, but a lot of the church buildings and a lot of the ministries have suffered. We have a financial connection. There's a lot of grant money that goes out every year, but the relational connection could have used some improvement. And so that's one of the things that we've been working on is how do we connect better now with our Native American churches? And then beyond that, and especially in light of the report from the last General Assembly, I mean, there's about $500,000 worth of just building work to do very basic things that needs to happen in this presbytery. And so we've begun that work as well. There's a $200,000 kind of starter fund to begin that work. We've been having meetings in the last few weeks even about the first set of basically $20,000 or $25,000 grants to churches, just to start with rewiring and roof and some very basic drainage issues and things at the churches, and to begin to get those improvements out of the way now, so that we can look at even the long-term relationship, the long-term ministry needs that are there, and making sure that these churches continue on, and that, just as a matter of justice, that that we take care of them and connect with them in ways that we haven't in the past.
Would, in this effort to not only, fix the church physical plants, but to also redevelop relationships, Would you say that there's a connectedness between that and the closure of Dwight Mission? Is there, I mean, are those connected in any way, or is that my?
I mean, I think that there's some connection, there's some not. I mean, the history is obviously connected.
Mhm.
Dwight Mission has run so independently for a lot of years, and even when they became their own independent 501(c), that it's kind of been its own thing out there
Right.
for quite a while now. The churches kind of have suffered from a similar situation where they're not independent, but we in some instances, they have been so hands off with one another that the relationships haven't been there, the support hasn't been there, other than sometimes with grants and those kinds of things. And so being able to now kind of transition to a place where we're working on the relationships, we're reinvesting in these congregations, we're looking at ways that we can support ministry and resource ministry, has been very helpful, a helpful turn for the presbytery. Dwight Mission has been its own journey, both because it's a camp and conference center, but then also because it was a camp and conference ministry of the 3 Oklahoma presbyteries, and then its own independent board, and it just being its own journey. I mean, the last 3 or 4 years of the board and of the management and of executive directors and just all the things that go into that, just kind of put it into a place where it wasn't going to be sustainable in our care anymore.
Right.
And so being able to transfer that back to the Cherokees as a historical site that has great value for them beyond the value it has for us as a camp and conference center has been, at the end of the day, a win, I think, for us, and just the best stewardship that we could have offered at this point. We talk about the needs of some of these Native American churches. It's an order of magnitude different of what was needed to get Dwight back into a place.
Oh, sure. But in terms of relationships, has that, has that impacted those relationships at all? I'm just sort of wondering out loud if that's been.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's come out of it is some great partnerships. I mean, I think we have some growing relationships with the leaders in the Native American churches and are plugged in different ways than we have been before. With all the negotiation and work and everything that's gone into the transfer of the Dwight property, particularly some of the folks from Eastern Oklahoma Presbytery that were involved in that, we've had a more one-on-one relationship with the Cherokees, and that's been a helpful relationship to foster as well, and something I think that will benefit us for the future.
So how long have you been in this role now?
Since 2019, since June 1st of 2019.
Okay, long enough for someone to make some mistakes. Are there any mistakes or things you might deem failures that other people either knew in mid-council leadership or that others can learn from, that you can think of?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a very interesting dynamic around the power of this position relative to our polity, relative to what people would want it to be, and kind of what they ask it. I've always been very clear with myself that this isn't a bishop role. I mean, and I mean that in a lot of different ways. There isn't a direct power that this role has, and that my job in a lot of ways is more resourcing and counseling and helping and suggesting paths for people and for churches and for committees as well, and kind of interpretation of the mission goals of the PCOSA and of the Presbytery and those kinds of things. It's been when I've strayed from that that there's been problems. I remember very early on there was, we get a lot of calls at the presbytery office that people call to ask about something or complain about a situation, or, is there some intervention that could happen,
Mm-hmm.
and you want to help in all of those situations. And especially if you are in a leadership role like a general presbyter, of being able to intervene in a situation to help make it better. And one of the early realizations was that your intervention often can make the situation worse or can escalate it beyond, something that is a small dispute in a church can become a large dispute in a church if the general presbyter gets involved with it too early.
Right.
So that's been a learning. On the other side of that, and frankly, making the opposite point, we had a church within the first year of me being in this position that split. And an earlier intervention in that situation probably would have been helpful, although it might not have made any difference either. So it's hard to kind of navigate where to plug in and where not to plug
Mm-hmm.
in, and where your intervention could make the situation better or worse. There's so much that goes on in EOP is kind of on the larger side of a medium-sized presbytery with 58 congregations, and so there's a lot of stuff that's happening, and because of that, you cannot be involved in everything and
Right.
be very directive and have your fingers kind of in all the pots at the same time. And so that was one of the things I kind of came to realize very early on, is that you just cannot be everywhere at every second. And you really do have to trust that the committees and the people that, that God has called in these positions can do the things that you've asked them to do, and that the presbytery has asked them to do.
And regardless of how much one situation might look like another situation, the context is always different, because you're always working with different people in slightly different systems, right?
Yeah.
Because of personalities. And so whether or not you enter a situation early or maybe later down the road might be different for another circumstance. And we're constantly learning.
Yeah.
We're, constantly learning those things. You almost just can't ever compare one to the other.
Right. Well, I think so much what I do is assessment. Assessment of a situation, of a problem, of a conflict, of whatever, and having a realization that I will never have a perfect knowledge of the system that's involved there, or the level of conflict, or all of the things that have happened in a church that led up to that minute and to that conflict at that moment.
Right.
And so how is, with the limitations of my knowledge, the limitations of of time and effort and those kind of things, what is the best outcome that I can personally help?
And I, throwing into all of that mix is the different perspectives that people bring to or the perspectives or expectations they might have on what your role is. Everyone seems to think everyone has a different understanding of what the GP role is. A lot oftentimes is way different from what our understanding is of the reality of the situation, or what our roles are.
And I think that a lot of that has to do with at the end of the day, what I think my role is matters as much as anything, because I'm the one that has to make the decisions about what I engage in, and what and at what level and to what degree. And so what expectations do I have of myself, and then how do I clearly communicate to everybody, this is my self-understanding of what I'm supposed to be doing. We can go back to my job description, but it goes back to, I'm not a bishop, and I don't want that kind of power, and in our polity, and in my faith, and in my understanding of the Presbyterian church, we've actually consciously made the decision that the committees and that a group of people make better decision than individuals on their own. And I tend to agree with that. And so how is it that we can, where you come to me with an emergency that may or may not be an emergency, then I can say, well, that's something that's COM or some other group needs to look at in due time, and have kind of a longer vision of what we're doing. Now there's emergencies where, that are actual emergencies, but a lot of it can wait on a committee maybe.
Right. And there are emergencies, and then there's the everyday committee work.
Yeah.
And
well, and what people think are emergencies because this is the first time they've experienced it, may not be an emergency because it happens 5 or 6 times a year, and the committee handled it all those other times too.
Right. And then there's sort of there is sort of a tightrope, a gray area of committee work and making sure resourcing a committee so that they can do their work. And sometimes that resourcing means saying, hey, you have to do this.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it goes back, and one of the roles that I would say that the General Presbytery does have is coordinating of resources and coordinating of priorities, and trying to help and resource the committees and then ultimately council of what goes first, what goes second, what goes third, so that things not only happen in an orderly way, but so that we're not having to reduplicate effort, and so that everything kind of fits together as we move forward. I mean, and frankly, that's one of the conversations we're having at EOP about new church development and about new ministries and things that we would like to be doing. We're still in a phase where we're closing churches, and there's several more churches that will need to be closed. We can go and we can support the Native American churches and some of the building things that need to be happening there, because that's a little bit easier decision than, well, let's, as a presbytery, go plan a new church development. That the apparatus that has to be in place, the people, the knowledge, the finances and everything that have to be in place for that to succeed are orders of magnitude more difficult than doing some already, there's bids already available for all of these projects with these churches, and doing something that is much more direct and efficient. And so that's hard for us in the denomination, especially when we're closing churches, especially when we're closing a lot of churches, is that the natural reaction is, hey, let's snap around here and we're going to go start planting new churches. But as a denomination, as presbyteries, we have not historically done that well, and we've failed in this presbytery to do it well. And there's an order that we have to kind of work into, and some foundational pieces that have to be in place before that happens. And that's a difficult part.
I totally agree with you, but I think that one of the steps that we miss, and I can't speak specifically to the presbytery, to Eastern Oklahoma Presbytery, but I think one of the steps that we miss is we fail to define what a successful church plant looks like.
Yeah.
What is a successful church? Is it outreach to the community and being right? Or is it self-sustaining financial income, which, by the way, isn't what Jesus calls us to be and do.
And that's a place where I'm fine with wherever we end up on those conversations. But when we have a nebulous idea of, okay, we're going to go start a new church without having that conversation about what it looks like and what success of what it looks like, then good intentions do not make for the thing to actually happen.
Right. You have to start laying out the expectations and having those conversations first before any of that can actually happen. So I'm so grateful.
And that's a hard part of leadership, to say we need to slow down.
Right. And, you are also you sit in the position where you see all the pieces moving all at one time. And the people who are fighting for, to move in this direction they don't have that privilege of seeing all those pieces.
Well, and
Yeah.
it's never a zero-sum game.
Hmm.
That, if we, let's say that we reallocate $1 million to go, start a new church, that we might have $1 million, but that $1 million is also going to take away from, something else we're probably doing as well. And if we go and start hiring people to start the new church and to start doing X, Y, and Z, that money gets drained down, pretty quickly when you start doing the budget on it. And so having some idea of that and having a kind of broader vision of what's happening in the presbytery, I mean, that's difficult to try to balance out those pieces. Because oftentimes, even at the presbytery level, we're very siloed into committee on ministry and council, and, preparation for ministry and these kinds of things. And we don't see necessarily how all the pieces fit together. And so I think interpretation and resourcing, and just kind of narrating some of those pieces is a big part of what I have to do as general presbyter, but then also trusting that council and the committees will make the right decision.
And I would say to you that, I mean, you haven't been, you said 2018, 2019 is when you came into this role. And just watching you, I think that is one of the gifts that you bring to, just one of the many gifts that you bring to this role, that is, you are able to think far ahead, and think, more broadly, and I guess from a different balcony, than the people, entrenched in the system, but also, even more so than some of our other mid-council colleagues. And I just really think that that's a gift that you bring to Eastern Oklahoma. I'm grateful for.
Well, and that was the question that you asked to kind of begin this part was about, what were you, how did you sense a call into this work? And having that kind of view of the presbytery, of the denomination, of kind of seeing how these pieces work together. I mean, that was one of the things that connected me with this work in a little bit different way. Is, there's a lot of coordinating of resources and a lot of coordinating of people's calls together to work towards, kingdom of God goals. And that, I mean, you have to have a broader vision of ministry than just what's happening in one church.
Right. So one thing you didn't mention about your personal life, you are a baseball coach, is that right?
Yeah. So both of my sons now have started playing Little League and T-ball, and the older one is now doing competitive travel baseball kind of around Oklahoma and Arkansas. And so at the lower levels of that, I've been an assistant coach for the older son's team. And then for my younger son, when they absolutely did not have any other T-ball coaches, I was the head coach for that team. So that's always been a very good kind of retreat from
a good diversion from the presbytery work.
Yep.
That's awesome. So a couple of quick questions that I like to end these conversations with EPs on. This one comes from Charlie Smith.
Okay.
What does he call it? Hashtag dashboard pounding.
Okay.
What would be your hashtag dashboard pounding tune?
I was thinking about that. I mean, right now, I'm in the car with the kids a lot, and either the drop-off line in the morning or the pickup right after I pick them up at night. So they sing along and yell to just everything. And they love Lizzo, which I find very interesting. And so they will sing a lot of Lizzo songs. one of mine goes back to my childhood. My mom was a big fan of Guitar Town by Steve Earle, and that's one that I could really sing and be animated to.
Okay, I'm gonna have to look that up. I've never even heard of it before. Guitar Town.
Guitar Town. This is a classic piece of music.
I'm older than you, so classic. This
is like a 1980s. Like, I mean, this would be right in your wheelhouse. And I think you would actually like it, frankly.
Okay. I'm gonna have to look that one up. Thanks. And favorite beverage, adult or otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I really am a big fan of Oktoberfest kinds of beers. I don't know. I don't like the super hoppy beers that really are kind of trendy. So Paulaner Oktoberfest Marzen is probably one of my favorites.
Are you one of those people who orders a beer flight wherever you go? No. You just know.
And a lot of that has to do with just all of the hoppiness and the sour and all the things that are very trendy right now. That's not my taste. So
okay,
I'm happy with dark brown beer that has a lot of maltiness, and that's just not where everybody's tastes are right now.
Okay, interesting to know. And next time we're actually face to face at a dinner, I'll buy you one of those special beers. Okay. Thanks for being with me, Tim. I really appreciate it. It's been fun.
No, I've enjoyed it. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah. In the Synod of the Sun, we believe when we work together across boundaries, we make visible the good news and find wholeness as the body of Christ. In our common calling, we impact lives together. So let's remember to connect with, equip, and empower one another in the name of Jesus Christ, today and every day.